Soviet surface ships and aircraft were searching for a missing submarine in an area known to be frequently patrolled by Soviet Gulf II class strategic ballistic missile submarines.
The most expensive heist in human history did not happen at a bank, it happened at the bottom of the sea. The CIA built a ship the size of 2 football fields just to steal a single Russian submarine. They promised the president they would get the codes, the missiles, and the maps. But when the claw finally broke and they looked at the pieces they had left, the mission was aborted. You honestly could not make this stuff up, and the mystery of what they found still haunts the ocean today. Missing Soviet nukes. In the middle of the Cold War, the world was a very scary place where 2 giant countries were always watching each other. In March of 1968, something happened that made the Soviet Union panic. One of their prize submarines, the K-129, just stopped talking. It was a giant diesel-electric sub that carried 3 ballistic missiles. Each of those missiles had a nuclear warhead that was 1 megaton strong. To put that in simple words, just one of those missiles could wipe out a whole city in a second. The sub was out on a normal patrol, but it never came back to port. The Soviets sent out dozens of ships and planes to find it, but they were looking in the wrong place. They spent weeks searching the North Pacific, but they found nothing but water. They eventually gave up and told the families that the 98 men on board were just lost at sea. But while the Soviets were looking over here, the United States was looking over there. The U.S. Navy had a secret system of microphones under the ocean called SOSUS. These microphones were so good they could hear a whale sneeze from miles away. They picked up a loud sound on March 8th that sounded like a giant hollow can being crushed. By using math and the timing of the sound, the U.S. Navy figured out exactly where the K-129 had ended its journey. It was sitting 3 miles down on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. This was way deeper than any human had ever gone back then. The sub was broken into pieces, but the front part looked like it might still have those nuclear missiles and secret codebooks inside. That is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to why the CIA got involved. The military knew they could not just sail a ship out there and start digging. The Soviets would see them and start a war. They needed a plan that was smart and secret. This brings us right to the next big mystery of how you hide a giant ship in the middle of the ocean. Most folks have no idea that the government turned to a famous and very rich man named Howard Hughes to help them. They told the world that Howard Hughes was building a special ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The cover story was that the ship was going to mine for small rocks called manganese nodules on the ocean floor. These rocks are real and they do have valuable metal inside, but that was just a big lie to keep the Russians away. The ship was actually a giant floating crane with a hole in the bottom called a moon pool. Inside that moon pool was a secret claw that the workers called Clementine. The plan was to lower this claw 3 miles down, grab the sub, and pull it up into the belly of the ship so nobody could see it. It sounds like a movie, but it is 100% real. The ship cost about $800 million back then, which is like $5 billion today. People thought the government was crazy for spending that much money on a mining ship, but they did not know the real prize. The real prize was the Soviet technology and the chance to read their secret messages. If the U.S. could read those messages, they would know every move the Soviets were going to make before they made them. Wait, there is one big problem with building a giant secret claw. It has to be strong enough to hold thousands of tons of wet metal while being pulled through miles of moving water. The engineers worked for years to make sure Clementine would not break. They used special steel and tiny cameras to see what they were doing in the dark. While they were building the ship, the Soviets were still suspicious. They kept sending spy ships to watch the Glomar Explorer while it was being built in Pennsylvania, and then moved to the Pacific. But the CIA was very good at keeping the secret. They even had fake scientists on the ship who would give interviews about rocks and mining. Plain and simple, it was the biggest game of pretend in history. The ship finally arrived at the spot where the sub was resting in July of 1974. The weather was rough and the waves were high, but they had to start. They began lowering the pipe string, which was made of sections that were 30 feet long each. It took days just to get the claw to the bottom. When they finally saw the sub on their cameras, it was a ghostly sight. It was covered in silt and looked like a graveyard. They moved the claw into place, and getting it to grab the sub was the hardest part. The claw had giant fingers that were supposed to wrap around the hull. But here is where it gets tricky because the ocean does not like to give up its secrets. The crew on the Glomar Explorer was holding their breath as the claw finally closed around the K-129. They could see through the cameras that the sub was stuck deep in the mud. It took a lot of power to pull it loose. When it finally popped out of the mud, a giant cloud of dust filled the water. They started the slow crawl back to the surface. They could only move a few feet every minute because they did not want the pipes to snap. For hours, everything seemed to be going great. They were about 1/3 of the way up when they heard a loud bang that shook the whole ship. Most people look right past this part of the report, but it was the sound of disaster. One of the giant steel fingers on the claw had snapped off. Because that finger was gone, the weight of the sub shifted. Suddenly, more fingers started to break under the pressure. The sub began to tilt, and then it happened. The main part of the submarine, the part that held the nuclear missiles and the control room, broke off and started falling. It tumbled back down through the dark water, hitting the ocean floor 3 miles below. The crew watched in horror as their prize disappeared again. All they had left in the claw was the very front section of the sub, which was about 38 feet long. When you look at the real facts, this was a massive failure. They had spent years and billions of dollars to get those missiles, and now they were gone for good. But the CIA told the crew to keep pulling up what they had. They needed to see if there was anything useful in the bow of the ship. When the remaining piece finally reached the moon pool, they closed the doors and pumped out the water. The air inside the ship became very heavy and smelled like old oil and sea salt. This is the part that makes absolutely no sense to people who think the mission was a total loss. Even though they missed the missiles, the small piece they caught was full of things they did not expect. Inside that front section, they found 2 nuclear torpedoes. These were not the big missiles, but they were still very important. They could study how the Soviets made their warheads and what kind of fuel they used. They also found sonar equipment that showed how the Russians listened for American ships. But the most emotional part was that they found the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors who were still inside their bunks. It was a very sad moment for the American crew. Even though they were enemies in the war, they were all sailors who knew how dangerous the ocean could be. The CIA decided to give these men a proper funeral. They filmed the whole thing so they could prove later that they were respectful. They put the bodies in a metal box and lowered them back into the sea while playing the Soviet national anthem. They even had a priest say a few words in Russian. It changed everything, no question about it, because it showed that even in a secret mission, there was still some room for being human. But while they were doing this, the leaders back in Washington were arguing. Some wanted to go back and try to get the rest of the sub, while others thought it was too dangerous. The Soviets were starting to figure out that the Glomar Explorer was not a mining ship. Fast forward a little bit and things looked totally different for the CIA team. They were planning a second mission called Project Matador to go back for the missiles. They were going to build a new claw that was even stronger than the first one. But then a news reporter found out about the secret. A story appeared in the newspapers that told the whole world about the fake mining ship and the stolen sub. The CIA tried to stop the story, but it was too late. Once the secret was out, they knew they could never go back. If they tried to sail over that spot again, the Soviet Navy would be waiting for them with guns ready. Let us switch gears for a second and look at what they actually took home. Failure at the finish. The mission was officially stopped because the secret was out, but the CIA had already started looking through the things they recovered. Most folks have no idea that the small section they pulled up had more than just torpedoes. They found maps and manuals that explained how the Soviet Pacific Fleet moved around. To say it was big is not even the half of it. Even though they did not get the code books, they learned so much about how the Russians built their ships. They saw that the steel was not as good as American steel, and the safety systems were very simple. This gave the US Navy a huge advantage because they knew the Russians were worried about their own ships breaking down. But there is a bit of a snag in the official story. Some people who worked on the ship say they found a lot more than the CIA admitted. There are rumors that they found a secret logbook that explained why the sub sank in the first place. Some people think the sub was on a rogue mission to attack Hawaii and that it blew up because of a mistake by the crew. If that is true, it would mean the world was much closer to a nuclear war than anyone ever knew. The CIA keeps those files locked away even today. Most people look right past this part because they focus on the broken claw, but the real story is in the papers they found. The part that nobody talks about is the radiation. When the sub broke apart, some of the nuclear material leaked out. The crew of the Glomar Explorer had to be very careful not to get sick. They had to wear special suits and wash the ship constantly. This might be one of the real reasons they aborted the mission so quickly. It was not just about the secret being out, it was about the danger of the site. The ocean floor around the K-129 is probably still a very dangerous place today. You honestly could not make this stuff up, but the government had to make sure the public did not panic about nuclear leaks in the Pacific. When you take away all the noise, it is about this. The CIA proved they could do the impossible. They built a ship that could reach the deepest part of the ocean and lift 1,000 tons of metal. Even if they only got a piece of it, the technology they created changed ocean exploration forever. Today, the things we know about the deep sea come from the tools the CIA built for this mission. But the mission also left a lot of questions that will never be answered. Did they find the ship's bell? Some say they did and gave it back to Russia years later. Others say the bell is still at the bottom of the ocean, waiting to be found. That brings us right to the next big mystery of what happened to the rest of the wreck. The K-129 still sits in the dark, but did the CIA actually tell us everything they found? Some think they got the codes and just kept it quiet. What do you think really happened down there? If you love these deep-sea mysteries, make sure to like and subscribe for more.